morning, take your Bibles, please, and turn to Matthew chapter 24. We're going to be looking at verses 36 to 51 this morning. That's the passage, by the way, where it talks about his coming will be like a thief in the night, and just wanted you to know that he doesn't like me to say this, but Michael wrote that song that he sang during the offertory for this passage of Scripture here. And I think that's a gift from the Lord to his church here. Loved those words. At a wildlife center in Zimbabwe, some British tourists were photographing animals that were behind a fence in front of them. And you can tell by their faces that these women thought they were capturing priceless images of African wildlife. But they had no idea that the real Kodak moment was happening directly behind them. For while they were intently trying to get just the right pose and angle of a zebra or a baboon or a golden-crested crane, a bull elephant had snuck up behind them. Imagine their surprise when they turned around and discovered the largest land animal on earth standing just a few inches from where they sat. How do you react to surprises? I suppose it all depends, doesn't it? It depends on how you interpret that surprise and how that surprise affects you. It's possible that one or two of these ladies might have been delighted by what they imagined was an adorable mammal tiptoeing up behind them because he wanted to play. But it's likely that some of them were scared to death by what they imagined was an enormous predator who viewed them as lunch. Like I said, it all depends on how you interpret the surprise, how that surprise affects you. And the very same surprise can affect people in radically different ways and produce radically different responses and results. And that is true, it will be true, of the most anticipated event of all time that is, ironically, the greatest surprise of all time. A surprise that will affect everyone living on the earth in profoundly different ways, producing profoundly different responses and results. Of course, I'm referring to the second coming of Jesus. We've been studying this, the whole Gospel of Matthew, but lately we've been in this passage we commonly refer to as the Olivet Discourse, Matthew 24 and 25. It was triggered by a statement Jesus made as he and his disciples were walking out of the temple, and some of them were admiring how grand and glorious it was. Jesus shocked them by telling them that one day that temple would be reduced to a pile of rubble. And that got the disciples to thinking. And so when they got to the Mount of Olives, they asked Jesus three questions. When will this happen? That is, when will the temple be destroyed? What will be the sign of his coming? And when would the end of the age occur? Or what would be the sign of the end of the age? The disciples assumed that all three of these events would occur almost immediately, probably within days or weeks. and that they would also occur one right after another. But in his response, Jesus let them know, and us, that world history was not going to come to an end anytime soon. He began by citing a number of phenomena that would occur in the future. He said, for example, that there would be widespread spiritual deception, political instability and international conflict, catastrophic natural disasters, hostility and hatred directed toward Jesus' followers, extensive apostasy and betrayal within the Christian community, an abundance of false prophets and duped people, and cold-heartedness in most people. When will these things happen? It is most reasonable, I believe, to interpret them happening during the time between Jesus' ascension into heaven and his return from heaven to earth. This is something the disciples didn't know about yet. They wouldn't know about that for another 40 or 50 days. It is a span of time the Bible calls the last days, a span that has now lasted for more than 2,000 years. However, beginning in verse 15, Jesus moves from the general to the specific. He's going to directly answer the disciples' first question: when will this happen? Or when will the temple be demolished? In verses 15 to 22, Jesus said that Daniel's prophecy that the temple would be defiled, what he called the abomination that causes desolation, would be fulfilled. He said that the situation at this time would be so dangerous and so desperate, would occur so suddenly, that the residents of Jerusalem would be forced to flee immediately and seek refuge in the hills, the mountains surrounding Jerusalem. So perilous would the situation be that Jesus said that people would not even have the few minutes needed to retrieve items from their home or even a coat lying on the edge of their field. He said that pregnant women and nursing mothers would be especially vulnerable during this time, and that it would be particularly challenging if it were to occur in the winter or on a Sabbath. Now, in my opinion, Jesus was referring to people who lived in the city of Jerusalem, people who observed Jewish customs, people who were dependent on their own two legs for transportation rather than on automobiles or taxis or helicopters or airplanes. Thus, there is every reason to believe that the events that occurred in Jerusalem in AD 66 to 70 are the fulfillment of Jesus' prophecy here in verses 15 to 22. That is when the Romans invaded Jerusalem, demolished and desecrated the temple, and caused Jews to evacuate the city, leaving it desolate. I believe this interpretation is supported by Jesus' declaration that this generation would not pass away until all these things had occurred. This generation, then, is the disciples' generation, the generation that actually heard him say these words. But of the three questions the disciples had asked Jesus, the one they were most interested in was when he would come in power and glory and take his place on the throne. Remember, they're not thinking about his death or his resurrection or his ascension or his return. They just want to know when he's going to establish the kingdom. They wanted a sign of that coming. But thus far, all Jesus has done is tell them when he will not come. And he's given them no signs. He's not going to come before the siege in Jerusalem. Neither will the destruction of the temple be a sign of his coming, he says. So what will be the sign of his coming? In the passage we looked at last time, a couple weeks ago, Jesus said the sign of his coming will be the appearance of Jesus himself in heaven, the sky. In other words, the sign of Jesus' coming is his coming. In other words, Jesus wants his disciples to know that there will be no advance sign that would enable them or us to predict the exact time of his return. He comes when he comes, and the people who are alive then will know it because they'll see it. Jesus reinforces this with a rather shocking statement in verse 36. But concerning that day and hour, no one knows, not even the angels of heaven, nor the Son, but the Father only. This is Jesus' plain statement that he did not know when the end of the age would come. Now that may seem surprising to us since he's the Son of God, but nonetheless it is clear. And acknowledging and accepting this point clears up a lot of confusion, I think, about the purpose of chapter 24. It tells us that Jesus was not meaning to predict the specific time of the end or the time of his return, since he himself did not know when it would be. It can only mean, therefore, that those who interpret Matthew 24, which a lot of people do, as Jesus predicting a series of specific events and phenomena that will immediately precede his return, are misguided. How could that be, since he himself did not even know when he was going to return? Which brings us to the real lesson, I believe, in the Olivet Discourse. Jesus' words are not so much to be taken as a prophecy about the future, but as a lesson in Christian living for the here and now. This is Jesus' warning that his followers always need to be spiritually ready precisely because they cannot know when he will return. And that his return is going to be sudden and unexpected. In other words, it's going to take people by surprise. Look what he says, beginning in verse 37. For as were the days of Noah, so will be the coming of the Son of Man. For as in those days before the flood, people were eating and drinking, marrying and giving in marriage, until the day when Noah entered the ark. And they were unaware until the flood came and swept them all away. So will be the coming of the Son of Man. You'll remember that it took Noah 100 years to build the ark. When he began construction, there were a lot of people who took notice about what he was doing. Some of them were skeptical from the start, thinking that he was crazy. But others, no doubt, were curious and inquisitive, perhaps sincerely wondered if Noah had heard from the Lord. But 100 years is a long time. And even friends and sympathizers lose interest after a while. With each passing day, Noah's prophecy that God would destroy the earth seemed less credible and more unlikely. Because remember, as human beings, we fall victim to the law of diminishing returns. That means that when we are exposed to something for a prolonged period of time, even something that initially amazes and impresses us, we become desensitized over time. We become less and less interested and impressed over time, so that eventually it ceases to have any real significance or make any real impact. And that's what happened in the days of Noah. While day after day and month after month and year after year, he was focused on building the ark, everybody else was carrying on with business as usual. They were eating, drinking, getting married, having kids, planting crops, building businesses. And while they were doing all these things, they could actually see Noah working hard, making slow and steady progress. But after a while, they became so accustomed to seeing it that they didn't give him or his prophecy a second thought. Somehow, Noah and his ark became remote, even though he was working right in front of them. And Jesus says, that's how it will be when he returns. People will have heard about the prediction of his return. They will be familiar with the concept. They will witness the slow and steady advancement of the gospel and the kingdom. But for most people, it will have absolutely no impact on how they live their lives. They will live as though Jesus' imminent return has absolutely no bearing or no relevance to their lives whatsoever. And therefore, when he does return, it will take them by surprise. Look at verse 40. Then 2 men will be in the field, one will be taken and one left. 2 women will be grinding at the mill, one will be taken and one left. I think it's perfectly appropriate to take Jesus literally here. When he comes, his followers who are on the earth at that time will suddenly disappear. We call it the rapture. Paul tells us in 1 Thessalonians, the Lord himself will descend from heaven with a cry of command, with the voice of an archangel, with the sound of the trumpet of God, and the dead in Christ will rise first. Then we who are alive, who are left, will be caught up together with them in the clouds to meet the Lord in the air, and so we will always be with the Lord. And in Corinthians, he said that this would happen in a moment, in a flash, in the twinkling of an eye. When Jesus returns, his followers, both those who were alive at the time and those who have already died and are in their graves or somewhere else, will be suddenly evacuated from the earth and will meet him in the air, leaving those left behind, unbelievers, to wonder and to marvel at their abrupt disappearance. And make no mistake, it will upset them. It will impact them. Look, one cannot see someone disappear right before their eyes and carry on as though nothing happened. It's going to cause even the most hard-hearted unbeliever to come to grips with the truth that Jesus is real and Jesus is Lord, and that they are not on Jesus' side, which means they're not safe from what lies ahead. They're in danger. They're going to have to face the consequences of their unbelief. Is that a fair interpretation of how unbelievers will respond to the rapture? I think so. If you think that this guy who's left in the field by himself, or the woman who is left grinding at the mill by herself are just going to shrug their shoulders and say, oh well, and get back to work, you're mistaken. We learned last couple weeks ago, that when he appears, everyone will see him, causing most people on the earth to mourn. This event will bring business as usual to a screeching halt, causing widespread panic. Jesus' coming will be sudden and unexpected, but it will impact everyone. And there are tremendous implications as we anticipate this day. Jesus talks about one in verse 42. Therefore, stay awake, for you do not know on what day your Lord is coming. Right? By the way, he's not talking here about literally staying awake and not going to sleep at night. He's using this metaphorically of being alert. And I believe this verse is a summary of the main idea of the Olivet Discourse, chapters 24 and 25. Here it is. No one knows when Jesus will return. But since he could return at any time, we must always be ready. Once again, the disciples had asked for a sign of his coming. Jesus told them the only sign of his coming will be his actual coming. And the problem with that from our perspective is that it doesn't give us time to prepare. We don't like to be surprised like that if we're not prepared. We'd like some advance warning so that we can tidy up our lives, get our house in order, get all of our ducks in a row. Verse 43, but know this, that if the master of the house had known in what part of the night the thief was coming, he would have stayed awake and would not have let his house be broken into. Look, rarely is there advance warning for a burglary. If there was, burglars would be out of business. Because the only reason burglars are successful is because they catch their victims by surprise. The point Jesus is making is that there's not going to be advance warning of his coming. It will come suddenly, unexpectedly, and it could happen at any time. So if you want to be prepared for his coming, don't look for signs. Don't look at world events and try to interpret them. Most especially, don't live carelessly as though it could not happen today, because it could. Be ready all the time. Jesus says in verse 44, therefore you also must be ready, for the Son of Man is coming at an hour you do not expect. So thus far, we can identify three principles from Jesus' words in verses 36 to 44. You can fill in the blanks, by the way, if you're taking notes. It's on the back side of your outline. Number one, Jesus could return at any time. Today, tomorrow, next week, next year, 100 years from now. The theological term for this, I've already discussed this with you, is the imminent return of Christ. Number two, Jesus' return will be sudden and unexpected and will take many by surprise. There will be no advance warning. It will happen when it happens, and it could be today, tomorrow, or 100 years from now. Number three, Jesus expects his followers to always be ready. In fact, he goes on to say that readiness or preparedness for his coming is evidence of whether someone truly belongs to him. Look what he says in verse 45. Who then is the faithful and wise servant whom his master has set over his household to give them their food at the proper time? Blessed is that servant whom his master will find so doing when he comes. Truly, I say to you, he will set him over all his possessions. Mr. Carson, the affable butler on PBS's television series Downton Abbey, is the epitome of responsibility, right? He's the embodiment of duty. His character oozes with integrity, loyalty, diligence, tirelessness, thoroughness, precision. He gets up early. He stays up late. He's attentive to his work all the while. He never complains. He never slacks off, never takes shortcuts, never passes the buck, never quits. And he does all this whether the master of the house is around or not. In describing someone who is prepared for his coming, Jesus uses the metaphor of a trusted servant, the manager of a household, like Mr. Carson. But the emphasis in Jesus' metaphor is faithfully attending to his master's business while his master is away, presumably for a long time, and an indeterminate amount of time. You don't know when he's coming back. We all know the proverb, when the cat's away, the mice play. Look, when the master's not around, there's a tendency to slack off, to be sloppy, to be careless, to be lazy, to procrastinate. Then, when you get the word that the master's coming home, you feverishly, anxiously work to get everything ready so he's not going to be disappointed, that you'll not get in trouble. But the point Jesus is making is that we don't know when the Master is returning. There will be no text message. There will be no phone call. There will be no advance warning. So if the servants slack off, they are taking the risk that the Master will return when his household is in disarray. Jesus says, it will be good for that servant when his master returns to find him performing his duties, attending to the master's business, being diligent with the responsibilities he's been given. How will it be good? Look at verse 47 again. Truly I say to you, he will set him over all his possession. Wow. That's quite a reward. And don't miss the significance of Jesus' words. How we live our lives on this earth in relation to Jesus' business, his will, his kingdom, his agenda, his specific assignment has eternal consequences. It determines our heavenly reward. So here's the fourth principle. Those who are prepared for Jesus' coming will receive his pleasure and his reward. And by prepared, I mean they're attentive to him and his business. However, the outcome will be quite different for those who are not prepared for his coming. Jesus continues with the metaphor of this household servant who has been put in charge of the whole household while his master is away for a prolonged period of time. He says in verse 48, but if that wicked servant says to himself, my master's delayed, and begins to beat his fellow servants and eats and drinks with drunkards, the master of that servant will come on a day when he does not expect him, and at an hour he does not know, and will cut him in pieces and put him with the hypocrites. In that place there will be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Yikes. That's a violent picture here. And of course, Jesus is talking about hell. He's referring to a place of conscious, unending torment where all those who have not put their faith in him will be assigned when he comes. And there is no relief in that place. There's no escape from that place. There's no hope in that place. And why will these faithless, wicked servants be damned? Because their self-indulgence, their idleness, their inattentiveness to the Lord and not taking him seriously proves that they don't belong to him. Which raises a question that I have to ask. Are you ready for Jesus' return? Are you ready right now? If Jesus came today, and he could, where would he assign you? Would it be in that place of honor and privilege and blessing with him in heaven? Or would it be that place of torment and suffering in hell? Friend, I hope you are not basing your hope of heaven merely on the fact that you call yourself a Christian, or that at some point in the past you prayed a prayer or signed a card or walked down an aisle at an evangelistic service. I'm not saying, by the way, that isn't the moment when you became a true follower of Jesus. But the proof that you really, truly belong to him is how you are living today. The proof, according to Jesus, is whether you are about his business, whether you take him and his return seriously, whether you are prepared for his return. Because the fifth principle in this passage is this: those who are unprepared for Jesus' return will be condemned. By the way, Jesus is going to reinforce this principle. You're going to hear this next week, the week after, the week after. And the stories that he tells that we're going to be sharing with you always end on the bad. It always ends with the negative. Why? Jesus wants to prevent us from going down that part. He wants us to enjoy him. Look, I asked you earlier, how do you react to surprises? And I suggested that it all depends on how you interpret that surprise and how that surprise affects you. And I also said that the very same surprise can affect people in profoundly different ways and produce profoundly different responses and results. Jesus' return will be the greatest surprise of all time. A surprise that will affect everyone living on this earth in profoundly different ways, producing profoundly different results and responses. Make sure this surprise is one that you welcome, one in which you can delight, one that is to your benefit. And the way to make sure is to give your life to Jesus, to be prepared for his coming. Not after you've sowed your wild oats, not after you've finished, you've completed your bucket list, or you've fulfilled your dreams in this world. If you postpone, it may be too late. Because no one knows when Jesus will return. But since he could return at any time, we must always be ready.